Hello, Blogging Heads Nation. I'm Daniel Drezner. I'm a professor of international politics at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University and a contributing editor at Foreign Policy Magazine.
I'm Heather Hurlburt, former executive director of the National Security Network and free radical.
That one took me by surprise. So have you put that on your business card yet, free radical?
I've been thinking about it, but I figure it would just start too many fights with people who perceive themselves as more radical than me. But I had to use it somewhere, so Dan and I thought we'd start our year-end review with our personal review. So folks, think of this as like the holiday letter from your cousins. Do
you send out holiday letters? I'm curious.
We used to. The last 2 years, we just kind of haven't gotten our act together to do it. But yes, we actually do send out printed holiday letters with photographs and lots of things that most people don't care about, but there is someone who cares intensely about every sentence.
Right. No, we do the same thing. I think we're kind of the generation that does this because we grew up in a period where the idea of writing a typed letter was perfectly okay, but the internet did not yet exist, so that you actually had to send these things by post.
Well, it's been really interesting this year. I've gotten several emailed letters from people who've been very apologetic or anxious about sort of would I think it was okay that they were sending email letters. And I just thought, look, if you get your act together to do it, I salute you. And I like opening envelopes and touching things. But I salute anybody who manages to get it together to communicate. So. No,
fair enough. The other thing is that I always this is a hard literary art form to master, the holiday letter. Which is, to what extent can you, if you veer too much on the "my year was awesome" sort of side of things, you inevitably alienate friends and relatives. On the other hand, if you veer too much into the "this year was horrible" and all these bad, it's the same problem. So it's a very fine line to walk.
Well, there's also the genre of how much of the letter do you spend reminding your friends of how much everyone else in the world is suffering?
Oh. You mean like, hi, have a happy 2013. By the way, people are shooting each other in South Sudan.
Yeah. Or by the way, as you, like us, are sitting home, indulging in a frenzy of consumerism and then lapsing into a food coma, people are shooting themselves in South Sudan.
Oh God, I don't put that in my holiday letter ever.
Yeah, I get letters like that. I try.
Oh, really? Oh, I understand the sentiment, but it's just, I don't think you need to ladle that much guilt out on, I don't know, that strikes me as an extremely inefficient way of trying to spread that message.
So just a quick anecdote that combines this theme and national security. Years ago when the blog Democracy Arsenal was just getting going, my former colleague Alon Goldenberg, it was one of the years that the Mets came really close to making the playoffs and collapsed at the end of the year, as distinct from the years that they're just bad all year and you don't get your hopes up.
Right.
They fell out of contention on maybe the last weekend of the season, and Elon put on Democracy Arsenal a picture of Mr. Met shedding a single tear, which spawned a flurry of outraged comments about how dare he put that on the blog when children were being killed in Iraq.
Oh, God, that's... I don't want to go off. No, I'm not going to go off on that kind of rant. It's an interesting question, which is how do you write about? Let me put it this way. I think this is sort of one of these things of how can you write about anything even mildly frivolous when there are people suffering elsewhere, which is, I suppose, a vein of argument you can take. But if you do that, you're going to lead a short, bitter, miserable life, because changing those things is really, really hard, and that is not the way you're going to motivate people to change them.
That last point is the one that I always make, that there is a small minority of folks who run toward misery whenever they see it and are very able to lead their careers fully steeped in it. And if you want
Let's call these people Sally Strutherites.
I don't know. She was an actress most of the time.
That's true, but you know why I'm saying that.
Yes.
Because of those commercials. But go ahead.
Yes,
Sorry.
Which we used to refer to as flies on the ice commercials.
That's bad.
When I worked in that field, yeah. So in fact, if you want to reach everybody else, you sort of need to present them with narratives that have at least the possibility of hope and positive change in them. And even if And then you get into the argument of, is it dishonest? Whatever.
No, this is actually an interesting question. I don't know. Do you follow Sarah Kendzior on Twitter?
Sometimes.
No, we have this running little thing because, I mean, she at one point tweeted like a week or two ago something about how hope is awful in terms of politics, that, you know, it gives this false sense of possibility, you know, and I tweeted back, and happy holidays to you as well. But, I mean, it's this interesting question of, you know, to what extent do you need to give a narrative that offers some possible, you know, sense of the way in which things are actually getting better. Sarah's clearly on the unremittingly negative side of this ledger. I'm a little more optimistic, but we have different. It's an interesting debate because there are times where I kind of see what she's saying and it's like, yeah, there's ways in which she's got a point, but at the same time, I agree with you. I don't think it's a way you're going to reach people who can potentially make a difference, for lack of a better way of putting it.
Yeah, I mean, one of the biggest reasons I am not a political speechwriter anymore is that when you're writing, you're sort of constantly perched on this knife edge between describing what is and describing what ought to be. And
right.
The more you veer toward ought to be in general, the better the speeches are. And sometimes that's okay, and sometimes it lands you in a place that's maybe not as honest as one would like.
Or it sets you up for a New York Times story 5 years later of 5 years ago, the guy who said this speech said the world would look like this, and it's actually looked like this.
Right. Or it sets you up for, you know, a sort of you can keep your plan moment.
Right. Oh, that's a fair point.
I mean, if you stopped and thought about it, I mean,
yeah.
If you, like, nobody should have been under the delusion that the President of the United States could control whether private insurance companies let you keep your plan or not, right? But he said it, so there you are. Anyway, so as 2013 comes to a close, I am being a senior advisor at National Security Network and doing some other wonderful work about which more announcements in 2014. But Dan, you're a little bit of a free radical at the moment as well.
I'm in transition, let's put it that way. So after 11 plus years, last week was my last blog post for Foreign Policy magazine. This is part of a larger sort of editorial change at FP. It's not like they targeted my blog in particular. You might notice that there are no real sort of traditional blogs per se anymore at Foreign Policy, that the other contributors, including, let's say, Steve Walt and Mark Lynch, as well as myself, are more drifting towards writing, you know, longer form traditional op-ed length columns, you know, on a weekly or semi-weekly basis. And this is, you know, it was an interesting change for me. You know, you're talking to someone who, for a quarter of my life, was doing this sort of blog, and it set up certain kind of habits that I was used to. You know, I'd wake up in the morning, particularly at FP. It was a very sort of clear schedule, which is I would wake up in the morning, scan my Twitter feed, read the front pages of the FT and the New York Times, figure out if there was something interesting to write about, and then over the next 45 minutes try to write it. And that varied somewhat depending upon whether or not I could actually come up with a good idea and whether the writing, you know, fairies were really motivated that day. But still, it's been interesting transitioning away from that structure. On the other hand, you know, because I'm going to continue to write a column for them, in some ways now it's a question of, oh, I've got an idea, and then I have to think, is that a blog post idea or is that an actual column-length idea? So this will be an interesting change for me, I think.
So does this say something larger about the demise of the Foreign Policy blog? Because, you know, I was talking a little bit earlier about the heyday of Democracy Arsenal, and
right.
You know, there, you know, at one point we had Democracy Arsenal, we had the international channel at TPM Cafe. There were a number of places where really interesting thinkers and practitioners in our field were blogging, and mm-hmm. And particularly with Foreign Policy shutting down, have we kind of exited that form as an issue area?
It's possible. I mean, I think there are still blogs out there that do really interesting work. Let's say like Duck of Minerva, for example. I mean, they trend a little more on the sort of IR theory side of things, but I still think they generate really good stuff. I mean, I think two things have happened. I think the first is that a lot of the blogs that used to exist out there have, for lack of a way of putting it, gone corporate. That a lot of traditional foreign policy outlets started developing online presences, you know, including FP, but also, you know, places like the National Interest or the American Interest, or even places like the New Republican Slate, you know, have added a foreign policy columnist online. So I think that's one thing that's happened. I think the other thing that's happened is Twitter. which is to say that the conversations that take place now are very often, it used to be like in the heyday of blogging, when you were at Democracy Arsenal and I was at my own blog, you would write a post and then I would respond to it with a post of my own, and then you would respond to it with another post or things like that. Or maybe even, back before spam took over, we would actually respond in each other's comment streams. I think Twitter has basically become the place where you do that now. And there's an advantage and a disadvantage to that. I think the advantage is that in some ways it's much quicker because you can only respond with 140 characters. You don't need to take months or not months, but hours to figure out a way to respond. On the other hand, you only have 140 characters, so it doesn't necessarily always lead to the most sophisticated of debates. But I found that in recent years there were times where I would find something on Twitter, make a response on Twitter, and then that would become the blog post. So I think that, but I think as a result of Twitter, it's sort of crowded out the shorter blog post, which I think therefore has led blogs, ironically, to sort of migrate back to the things that blogs were sort of challenging in the first place, which is the traditional op-ed column. But I'm curious if you would agree with that.
Well, I was thinking about the sort of exception that proves the rule there, and that is the blog lawfare and the emergence in this year, one of the really interesting developments this year of a serious sort of partner/competitor to it, Just Security. And those both, very self-consciously style themselves as blogs, but in fact, their format is more like short pieces written by law professors or short pieces written by law professors for lay audiences. So on the one hand, that's a real, sort of growth, and you've got lots of new, really, really top-notch national security law voices blogging at both of them, and it's like auditing a law course to go and spend a bunch of time on them. But at the same time, they are not the kind of back and forth freewheeling interchange that you associated with, the golden age of national security blogging.
I really look forward to that book being written about the golden age, or maybe the documentary on VH1 behind the blog.
I think you better hurry up and get the book. Actually, the moment that you've stepped down, you should really be pounding out the book proposal over the holiday break, shouldn't you?
Unfortunately, I have two things. I've got other books I need to finish over the break.
That. Well, then we'll skip directly to who plays us in the video documentary.
Oh, that's a good question. Who would play you? Let me think. I'm trying to think who I would cast for you.
There's some actress from Family Ties that I used to get told I looked like. Justine
Bateman?
Yes.
Ooh, that's not a bad. You could do worse. I was actually very pleased. So one of the things they did, if you noted on my foreign policy thing, is they kind of Wall Street journaled my photo. So now it looks like one of those the journal engravings of photos. And I uploaded it onto Facebook, and a friend suggested Josh Brolin for me, and I can live with that.
So lest we make this all about us and fall any further into stereotype, this year, what the hell do we make of this year?
Well, Heather, I mean, let's face it, this was a year where the United States just surrendered. Wait,
I missed that. When did it happen?
Oh, come on. I mean, clearly, we've surrendered in Syria. We've surrendered in Iran. We surrendered Ed Snowden to Russia. The pivot fell apart.
I'm sorry, someone has snatched Daniel Drezner and replaced him with a crazy raving interventionist, because if you are saying that we surrendered in Syria in a year that the U.S. got chemical weapons out and avoided being drawn into the fighting, I'm really worried. I'm going to actually call the police in Boston and see if you're missing.
Well, let me put it this way. Obviously, I don't agree with that. But I mean, there is that narrative out there about 2013. So I mean, let me give the most sophisticated version of this narrative I possibly can, which is to say that 2013 was the year that you can argue American public opinion made it very loud and very clear that it does not want to see U.S. force being used for anything other than truly core national security interest threats. Which resonates, as it turns out, with the natural proclivities of the Obama administration. So as a result, even in areas where President Obama might have been originally tempted to use force, let's say Syria after chemical weapons were used, the American public acted as a powerful enough constraint for him to instead cut a deal that as a result will essentially legitimate and keep Bashar al-Assad in power. Similarly, there are other areas, think Iran, and for that matter in the Pacific Rim, where the United States has sort of made it clear that it would rather reach an accommodation with countries that do not necessarily share our values than trying to pursue a maximalist policy of, pushing human rights and democratic values elsewhere. And as a result, like Steve Chapman just wrote a piece for the Chicago Tribune pointing out that human rights and democracy, values that we presumably want to promote elsewhere, are in some ways in retreat. And so the problem is not so much that the United States lacks the power to do these things, but rather we lack the willpower to do it. And other countries such as China or Russia or Iran can clearly read that, collapse of willpower. And so as a result, they can expand their sphere of influence. And so while, this doesn't mean obviously that the United States is in full-on retreat, it does mean that the arc of history is bending against the United States.
So help me. Is this actually your argument, or are you?
No, that's not my argument at all. But you got to admit, I thought that was a pretty decent articulation,
So, since now that you've cleverly avoided saying what you actually think.
I'll say what I actually think later, but go ahead. You go first.
No, so if we actually don't start from the premise that the United States is at the center of absolutely everything, which I know is radical and shocking all by itself, mm-hmm. that we're going to look back, and this has been an enormously confusing year. You have Europe looking like an utter disaster for most of the year, and yet muddling through. Greece did not collapse. Greece did not fall out of the EU. The euro didn't collapse. Paul
Krugman even admitted he was wrong about that.
Well, that might be a development all by itself.
There you go. Yeah.
But so European democracy and European Union come out of this year, not nobody's running to give them a prize for anything, but not looking nearly as bad as was predicted at various points.
Okay, hold on. Let me push you back a little bit. Would you argue that sort of developments in Ukraine, though, suggest, in fact, the very hard limits of the attractiveness of the European model?
The developments in Ukraine suggest ultimately the primacy of geography.
Okay.
I'm a little bit of a nace. I lived in Ukraine. You
lived in Ukraine too? I didn't know that. Where did you live?
I am so old that I studied Russian in Kiev when it was still part of the Soviet Union.
Oh wow! So I lived in Donetsk when it was part of Ukraine. When it was when it was Ukraine. But go ahead.
What were you doing in Donetsk?
Oh, I taught. I was there for civic education project. So I taught economics for the year in Donetsk during the year that Ukraine was suffering from hyperinflation. It was awesome.
Yeah, well, but this is kind of exactly the point, because if you are a factory worker or a factory owner in Donetsk, you know very well that having an association agreement with the EU is not going to solve your problems, and in fact, it is going to make them worse. Yeah. Right? So that's just, number one, that's a hard political reality, and people in Donetsk are not stupid, and they know that. Point number two is nothing the European Union was prepared to do was going to change the reality of Ukraine's energy dependency on Russia. And again, people in Ukraine know that too.
Right.
None of this is to defend Ukraine's corrupt and unimaginative government. And the way the whole thing played out was foolish and unfortunate. But there's been a lot of commentary in the West suggesting that somehow if Ukraine had chosen to go with the partnership agreement, all of its problems vis-a-vis Russia would have been solved, and that just isn't the case.
Right.
And it also overlooks, that Ukraine, as you know, is a fundamentally divided society, and for every, person in the square in Kiev, there's a person in Donetsk who, thinks every kind of closer union with Russia is a really good idea, and from his perspective is not wrong.
I would caution that. I mean, one of the interesting things about what's happened recently is the fact that the sort of Eastern oligarchs, as it were, have not necessarily been jumping up and down saying, yeah, closer union with Russia. I think they're not, you're right, they're not naive in thinking that a partnership agreement with the EU is going to solve everything, but I think they're also fully aware that joining the Eurasian Union, for example, is also in some ways a threat to their existence also. So I think it's not – I think the fascinating thing is that Ukraine has failed in a way that, let's say, countries like South Korea have not, in learning how to play different geopolitical poles off each other to actually prosper. A country like South Korea, and it's an unfair comparison because South Korea is a dynamic economy, but South Korea is a big enough economy so that it matters to the region, and yet they've actually been able to maintain close ties with the United States and actually rapidly improving ties with China. The recent Addis incident aside, whereas Ukraine seems inept at trying to somehow play Russia and the EU off each other.
Yeah. So inept is a good description, but I think to make your South Korea analogy fair, imagine if a third of South Korea's population were ethnically Japanese or ethnically Chinese.
Chinese, right. No, that's a fair point.
Think about how much harder that would be for a South Korean government. But to go back to the bigger point, the Ukraine thing represents look, first and foremost, the Ukraine debacle represents the year in Russia, right? Mm-hmm. And the year in Russia is Putin being determined to flex muscle wherever he can find and stymie the West in general and the U.S. in particular, wherever, and that's kind of his MO of staying on top in Russia, as there's questions about whether he's a lame duck, there's questions about the Russian economy. So,
oh, Heather, it's the world, though. I mean, Forbes did anoint him the most powerful man in the world.
Well, that's only because Time already took the Pope. But
that's fair. I'm sorry. That was easily the most ludicrous designation I've seen. The idea that Vladimir Putin is the most powerful person in the world really suggests that Forbes should get out of anything involving the word power.
Right, but on the other hand, if Forbes wants something from him, it's a brilliant thing to do.
Oh, that's a fair point. I hadn't thought about that.
I'm totally prepared to say, Forbes, I don't know, they want to hold a big conference and they want to actually do it in the Kremlin or something like that.
I see. Okay, fair enough.
No, but so that does, so the year in Russia, right, is that after years and years and years of saying, we're gonna have a reset with Russia. Well, it turns out you can't actually reset Vladimir Putin, and the reset worked for a while to accomplish a certain set of things, and then Putin decided he wasn't interested in it working anymore. He had more significant interests that he wanted to pursue, and he's now pursuing them. And the U.S. can't.
Let me ask you another question here. And again, this
stop him from pursuing his.
But let me ask you a question which ties back into this theme of American retreat. Do you think Putin made that decision once it became clear that the U.S. was going to get out of Afghanistan in 2014, regardless of whether there was going to be an agreement with the Karzai government or not? Because you could argue Afghanistan was the one area where Russian interests and U.S. interests were thoroughly aligned, because Russia wants in some ways to prosecute the war on Islamic terrorism even more vigorously than the United States. So once it became clear that the U.S. was going to be pulling out of there, there was no quid pro quo for the Russians to pursue.
I think that's a really that's the wrong way of reading both Russian calculations and what's happened.
Okay.
Both because U.S. in Afghanistan, U.S. not in Afghanistan, Putin has the domestic constraints and domestic needs that he has, and there is nothing like kicking the United States to deal with his domestic constraints and needs. Point two is the interesting thing is, even as everything else or so much else in the U.S.-Russian relationship has gone to hell, has been really unproductive. You've had the difficulties with Syria, the difficulties on human rights, the near collapse of the nuclear agenda, the bilateral sniping. You've still had very steady cooperation on Afghanistan and CT, which suggests that, exactly for the reasons that you said, Putin has made the calculation, and he's not wrong, that the U.S. is not going to put its activities in Afghanistan or its counterterrorism work in jeopardy over his shenanigans. And
right.
The word. But it's carefully calculated on his part. And I think the other thing to say is, and here we can sort of shift into the Middle East and the year in Syria, but when Putin thought there might actually be American missiles flying that would show how bad the anti-missile stuff he sells to Syria is, then he got very interested in getting engaged and making sure his power and his guy were perceived in the region, and was then willing to put some Russian skin on the line. And the last thing I'll say is that in actual fact, the Russians have not been spoilers with Iran this year in a way that they might have been.
No, the last part is very true. But that's interesting. I have not heard the argument that the reason Putin made the deal on Syria that he did was not because of a fear of American power, but rather a fear that American military prowess would show up Russian anti-missile defenses.
But the one is a subset of the other. Right?
Well, it's a specific subset, though. I mean, it didn't occur to me that it was because it was Russian, that it would show the weaknesses of Russian military equipment. That's an interesting point.
Well, if you think about it, and you're some country's leader, and you say to yourself, well, who needs the Americans? Who needs the Americans? We can always buy as much military equipment from the Russians as they want to.
Right.
But, guess what? There's a reason that wasn't your first choice in military equipment. Now, some of their stuff is fabulous and top notch, and I'm not I'm not universally bad mouthing it, but remember Iraq? Remember how the Russian air defense stuff was going to be an incredible impediment to the U.S.?
Yeah, fair point. That's an interesting argument. Let's actually, you were talking about wanting to shift to Syria. I mean, that's a fair way of let's do that. Which is to say that, given how things played out in Syria this year, I mean, that's in some ways the area where you could argue that the United States, I mean, there is a very, I'm with you on this, there is a very realpolitik, prudent sort of course of action where you can argue the Obama administration was absolutely correct not to get involved in Syria because there was no good outcome, or there was no outcome that was truly going to represent a major advance of U.S. foreign policy interests beyond the fact that you got chemical weapons out of there. That said, how do you counter the argument that, and I've heard this from high-ranking people, that Syria is now essentially the new Pakistan? That it is now a sort of, it's ground zero for all the sort of interests in the Middle East that we don't like, and because it is a sort of lawless zone at this juncture, in essence, it provides a base for all these various anti-American groups that maybe not now, maybe not even a few years from now, but 5-10 years down the road is going to come back and haunt us.
Well, I would actually step back a little further than that and say, Syria is a catastrophe, and Syria is an enormous shame for every power, every global source of power and legitimacy that says it cares about democracy and about human life. Even before you get to any realpolitik interest, just everybody out there who has ever said there is an international order and there are values that we uphold, Syria is a catastrophe. Mm-hmm. And in some ways, it may turn out, and I personally, having been a skeptic about what there was we could do, am haunted by this, that in fact, the real year of failure in Syria was late 2011, early 2012, before you completely lost your non-violent, non-extremist opposition, when you still had a moment where some kind of international involvement could have led to a transitional government, and before the extremist groups managed to get themselves in the door. Now, hindsight is 20/20. At the time, I was not in favor of any kind of intervention, and it may be that this is a tragedy that had no other outcome, in part because not just the United States, but all the regional powers didn't see. I mean, this is a great kind of politics 101 prisoner's dilemma, right? Nobody in late 2011 thought it was worth doing what you could have done in late 2011 that would have been a hell of a lot easier and cheaper than anything you could do now to lessen.
Right. It's worth remembering, for example, that Turkey was always the country that's sort of on the on the forefront of trying to foment regime change, and Turkey had many opportunities. Yep. There were many provocations where Turkey could have decided, all right, that's it, we are actually going to move full force into Syria, and every time they passed.
Yep. And so there is this critique that people make of the Obama administration from a humanitarian or now, for the reasons you laid out, from a counterterrorism perspective, saying, oh, the administration failed, it missed the boat, it should have done something in 2013, it doesn't matter what it is, we have to do something. But, the failure here is a regional failure of imagination of how bad this could get and how bad it could get for everybody. So, having said that, I hadn't heard that Syria is the new Pakistan before. And in a way, I mean, again, from a humanitarian perspective,
this came, by the way, from my visit to Fort Meade, by the way. So, I can say that.
But, I mean, if you had the choice of being dropped into Pakistan or dropped into Syria, wouldn't you choose Pakistan?
Yes, you would choose Pakistan.
I would.
Yeah.
I mean, although I grant you, Pakistan has a nuclear weapon, so it's also interesting to me that the intel guys are worrying about it from that perspective. So yet Syria is an individual failure, and Syria is also a systemic failure. And for anybody who thinks that international norms or international systems have meaning, we got nothing. We got nothing to deal with Syria. And so 2013 should sort of be the year that everybody anywhere in the world, whether you're the U.S., whether you hate the U.S., whether you're a neocon, whether you're, an Islamist, that you look around and you say, man, how lots of those people didn't have to die, and lots of the decades of regional conflagration that are going to happen. And by the way, I'm not sure that the model of, in 10 years this is going to come back and bite the U.S. is the right model. It's going to come back and bite our allies and friends and economic interests in the region in a year, in 6 months. So I'm not, the Pakistan thing, for those of us who remember the 80s and 90s, is vivid in one way, but for the same reasons that we don't have blogs anymore, we have Twitter. We're not going to get 10 years before this starts.
Oh, I see your point. Yeah, no, that's a fair argument. And certainly the extent, I mean, in some ways, the other issue with Syria is that even if you could, I mean, I'm like you. I was not a big fan of U.S. intervention in the region, but seeing the way in which the carnage has continued does bother me in the sense that you do have to wonder, is there in fact something that could have been done that would have changed the balance of power on the ground? But even from a realpolitik perspective, one of the issues going forward is that clearly the two most critical allies to the United States in the region, namely Israel and Saudi Arabia, are looking at what's happened in Syria and look how the U.S. dealt with it and essentially see it as an issue of abandonment. That the U.S. has been fickle and, reluctant to engage. And as a result, if you're based in Riyadh or you're based in Tel Aviv, you have to start making the calculation of, well, what does this mean for the future in terms of the U.S. commitment to us?
Well, this, is a trend about this year that I think is really worth digging out and thinking about, which is that, in so many ways, the way the Obama administration has approached this issue is the way that the rest of the world has said they want the U.S. to approach global politics for years. Oh, we don't want you to tell us what to do. We don't want you to come in and impose solutions. We want you to listen to us. Well,
except it turns out that by that what they meant was, we really do want you to intervene. Heather?
Yeah, sorry, I lost you there for a second.
Oh, I'm sorry. What I said is, and when they say that, what they're actually also saying sotto voce is, please intervene.
Yeah, and the Clinton administration learned that the hard way in Bosnia, right? Where Warren Christopher went to Brussels and said, so, we thought we'd do this, and everybody said no, and he came home and said, well, they said no. And then everybody said, well, we said no, but we don't have any other. So, but even compared to the 90s, and this takes us into the sort of the declinist argument.
Yeah.
The balance of power is different. Absolute power is different. There are lots more countries that have lots more absolute power than they used to, which means the power to get involved and mess things up. And so, 2013 is sort of the year where the administration actually, in a fairly disciplined and consistent way, had a set of policies and put them into action. And you may vigorously disagree with them, but they were pretty disciplined and consistent about them.
Well, it depends on the area. Like on Iran, I agree with you. They were pretty disciplined, and it was clear how they sort of saw the path forward. There is no way you can say that the administration was disciplined when it came to Syria. Even if you like the policy outcome on Syria, the way they bollocksed up the process, and this is one of the points I made in a column back in the fall, which is, part of the reason that I think U.S. allies in the region are ticked off with the United States is in part because of the content of the policies, but also because they were kept out of the loop in terms of the decision-making process. That there was not, what the term George Shultz used was gardening, or sort of caretaking among the allies. And one of the reasons there wasn't that much gardening is because within the Obama administration itself, there wasn't necessarily a hell of a lot of policy coordination. Particularly on Syria.
The president was walking in the yard. I mean, if that doesn't count as gardening, what does?
I'm sorry, the what? Walking in the yard? Oh,
President you're totally right, except I do think it's important to there was a very consistent line of we're not going to get that involved in Syria with that one kind of 4-week, whatever you want to call it.
Right. I mean, let me put it this way. You can say it was, I mean, you can absolutely say it was very clear what Obama's preference ordering was, but his strategy did change over time. And that, and if I was an ally in the region, I would have been pissed off about that.
Mm-hmm. I mean, but so a couple of other things. So as you say, Iran, they've been very disciplined and focused on, and managed to screen out an incredible amount of background noise coming from here, and an incredible amount of political pressure coming domestically, which is fascinating. And also, by the way, John Kerry and the Middle East peace process, who people gave that zero credibility, zero sort of staying power, and here he is. He just...
Can I ask you a question? I do want to ask a question on Iran, and particularly on the domestic politics of it, because you being based in D.C. might be a little more clued in than I am, which is the thing that I'm fascinated by with Iran more recently is this, clear pushback by the Senate on trying desperately to come up with sort of a new sanctions, measure. And I understand somewhat why some Republicans are pushing for this. That's sort of the traditional hawkish position of, no, let's squeeze them even tighter. But I have to admit, I'm genuinely a little puzzled that there is so much GOP support for this as well as Democratic support for this. Because if you take a look at the polling on it, Americans are skeptical about the negotiations with Iran, but they're also very clear that they prefer at least going down that track for a while. So it's not like I'm seeing this massive groundswell of support. In fact, indeed, I think there was a Politico article where Bob Corker pretty much admitted that as the Iran deal, when the interim deal was being announced, there was absolutely no phone calls to his office opposing the deal, even though he went out full bore, very critical of the administration. So I don't understand why the Senate is getting so exercised about this.
So two reasons, and you'll love them both. You could teach them both in a politics class.
Okay.
Reason number one is there are a number of Senate Democrats who genuinely believe that they need to play the bad cop to Obama's good cop. That they genuinely believe that it is the Senate putting on more and more and more sanctions that gets the negotiating gains that Obama has achieved. And
I would argue, to be fair, you can argue that what the Senate did in the 2 years prior to this year, they're actually right on that, because Obama opposed a lot of the sanctions that wound up being, passed by the Senate. And you can argue that those sanctions did bring, it was mostly the EU actually cooperating, but that said, those sanctions did bring Iran to the table.
Yeah, I think... the other sort of hesitation I have about that argument is that, ultimately it's the fed-upness of Iranians with the dysfunction of their own economy, which is partly due to the sanctions, but at least as much due to the dysfunction of the Iranian economy. Yeah, so politics of the Iran deal. There is, and if you look at the polling, you see this, there's a strong vocal minority, particularly on the GOP side, that doesn't want or trust any kind of deal with Iran. And there's an element of the policy elite that thinks that the military solution is the right one. There is, by the way, not an element of the military elite that thinks this.
But it's not just Congress. Opposed to this idea for forever.
And, you know, people who are particularly close or feel that they need to be seen as particularly close to the Netanyahu government also feel that it might be too risky politically not to be out there pushing for more sanctions. So between those two developments, you have an awful lot of incentive to be out there doing what Senator Corker described as shadowboxing, where you're at least appearing to be about to put on more sanctions. Now,
right.
The problem is, if you're sitting in Tehran, you can't necessarily be so sure that you're discerning what's shadowboxing and whatnot. So, as I say, it's just a great kind of, you know, somebody could do a really complex political model of it with all these different inputs and perceptions and whose perception is helpful and at what point does those perception turn from being helpful into being harmful.
Although this also, I mean, and I would say two things in this. The first is it also works in reverse, which is, you know, it's not like Rouhani, you know, has got an unconstrained hand trying to negotiate this as well. And so as a result, you know, it's tough for us to interpret, you know, it's worth remembering Rouhani is not the most important, most powerful actor in Iran. So it's this question of to what extent can he negotiate and to what extent will the hardliners impose a veto. But the other thing that I think, and you know, we might want to start thinking about wrapping up, but the other thing that I think is fascinating has been that I would argue that the biggest change in 2013, hands down, is that this was finally the year where American public opinion really did exert a pretty powerful constraint on what an administration could do with respect to the use of force. Because I would argue that as much as the outcome in Syria, for example, was a function of what Obama wanted to do, it was also the case that, you know, American public opinion was overwhelmingly opposed to the use of force there. And, you know, they've also by and large supported the Iran deal, even while at the same time, I'm actually really impressed. Americans are very sophisticated about this. They've actually said, we don't really trust the Iranians. We're pretty skeptical that this will work out. But nonetheless, this is the policy course that is worth pursuing. And, you know, this had been predicted for a decade, since the Iraq War. But it was fascinating to me that even, you know, during the Libya intervention, you know, Americans weren't thrilled about it, but they didn't really come out hard against it. They are now hard against it, any kind of use of force. And, you know, I'm sure you've seen the Pew data as well, that, you know, a majority of Americans now essentially want to leave the rest of the world alone. That doesn't mean, you know, that's not isolationism per se, but when it comes to the use of force, Americans have become risk averse in a way that I have not seen in the polling data for quite some time.
Yeah, and I think one of the really fascinating things that has been going on inside the Beltway is you cannot overstress how shocked members of Congress were by what happened on Syria and how stunned they were by the avalanche of public opinion. And you see, I have a forthcoming piece that looks at how various 2016 hopefuls have chosen to react or not react to the Iran deal, and you really see that nobody's sure which rules apply anymore.
Right. And but it's not just Congress. I mean, my understanding is the administration was also surprised by the depth of the reaction on Syria.
Yeah. Now, I also just have to say, as a practitioner, that I think, as we noted, the process that led up to the Syria debate was maybe not optimal. Yes. And if you want to be able to do something with public acquiescence, there are maybe other things you might have chosen to do or not do. I do want to note, Dan, that we have failed to pivot to Asia, you and I.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. We can do that.
We have to at least give sort of 30 seconds to, you know, 2013 was again supposed to be the year that we all really understood the preeminence of Asia. And again, it was a year that our sort of policy dialogues were all about the Middle East, as this one has just been.
Yeah.
We get to the end of the year, and the Trans-Pacific Trade Agreement, which is supposed to be sort of the foundation of U.S. resurgence in the region, looks like it's bogged down and maybe not going to get done anytime soon. What do you have to say about 2013?
Well, all right. So, I mean, I think, let's face it, you know, if you look at U.S. grand strategy or U.S. foreign policy in 2013, it can all be summed up with that tagline from The Godfather Part 3, which is, you know, Michael Corleone, you know, trying to go legit. He says, every time I think I'm out, they pull me back in. And I think that's how Obama has to feel about the Middle East, which is he wants to focus on the Pacific Rim for a whole variety of really good, you know, geostrategic reasons. And yet every time he tries to focus on the Pacific Rim, the Middle East keeps, you know, pulling him back. But with respect to the Pacific Rim, I think I'm a little more optimistic about the Trans-Pacific Partnership than you are. I mean, my understanding is they're probably going to probably by the end of the first quarter of 2014 they'll have a deal to negotiate. And also it seems like that President Obama might actually even get Trade Promotion Authority. Although I do wonder how Max Bach. Sorry, say that again.
What Congress is going to tell me how that's going to happen, because I don't see Republicans handing him that victory, and I think he's going to have real trouble with Democrats on TPP.
Well, I would say it this way: I was more confident about this until Max Baucus got the nod for U.S. ambassador to China, because Baucus had been sort of brokering a deal on Trade Promotion Authority. That said, I mean, this strikes me. Let me put it this way: if you're a Republican in Congress, or if you're John Boehner, let's bear in mind that the Congress closed out with an interim budget deal, which actually I think was generally speaking relatively popular. It's not like you're going to cooperate with the Obama administration on everything, but there do appear to be a few issues where, in fact, there are an alignment of interest. One would be immigration. Another would be trade. And so it's, again, I do feel a little bit like Charlie Brown saying this, because I've been saying this for year upon year upon year. So it's possible it could be wrong, but I also have a bet with Phil Levy that this is actually going to happen. So I've got a stake in this actually working out. And I think this time the additional argument the Obama administration can make is in fact the geopolitical one, which is to say TPP, in terms of the economics of it, is actually not that big of a deal. I mean, it encompasses a large number of countries, but the actual value added isn't significant. What's significant about it is the same reason the European Union, for example, is significant in the European continent, is another sort of form of soft security that you can offer to countries in the region. And it's clear they very much want it, I would add. So I think if you make the case that, look, this is not just about the economics, this is about reassuring our allies in the Pacific Rim that we are going to be staying in the Pacific Rim, you might actually get more GOP support. That might be naive, but I do think that that's going to happen. And furthermore, in some ways, China, by once again putting their foot in it with respect to the air defense zone, I think will actually help matters.
Yeah, no, I want to, that last point first. Richard Fontaine at CNAS and some colleagues actually had an article pointing out that China, by taking the steps that it took with the air defense zone, actually sort of helped shore up U.S. alliances in the region. And so in some ways that turns out to be a helpful development. On the trade thing, you're right. My pessimism decreased slightly once the deal, once Boehner showed he could actually get the House to vote for something.
Right.
I think exactly because of what you said, the economic implications are not that significant, and the point is soft security. How can I put this? The soft security argument is unconvincing in Congress. It's unconvincing on both sides of the aisle.
Okay.
And where people also have stakeholders coming in and saying, well, okay, that's so interesting. The economic benefits aren't very big. The economic costs are real. The costs of declining standards, which is perceived to be part of this, are very real. And then you're telling us there's no economic benefit. It's just about somebody else's security. Unlike the Cold War, where you could make that argument and there was sort of a switch in American elites that you could just flick and it got that. People who think that there's a free pass when you flick that switch are in for an unpleasant surprise, I think. And I also just want to say as a last point, I'm a squishy Democrat on trade. I want to see trade expand, and I want to see U.S. position in the global economy grow, and I think we could often do that with a lot more focus on labor and environmental standards in ways that would advantage both us and people in other countries than we do. And both TPP and the Transatlantic Agreement look to me like real missed opportunities for a Democratic administration to have pursued negotiations in an open stakeholder manner. And on the one hand, you froze out labor, you froze out environmental groups, which is unfortunate. You also, frankly, Congress feels frozen out, like they weren't consulted enough, and that, just from a pragmatic viewpoint, is going to come back and hurt you.
That's possible. I would say a few things on this. First, I don't buy the argument that the TPP will lead to an erosion of standards. by implementation. In fact, if anything, you can argue that the primary criticism about TPP at this point has been the fact that the United States is pushing incredibly onerous intellectual property provisions within the agreement. So I'm not.
Let me just say that I think both things are true.
Okay.
I agree with you. I agree with you about intellectual property, but that's not the same as, say, health and safety standards, content standards, national environmental standards. So both things can be true.
Yeah, fair enough. But the second thing I would say two things. First, had the Obama administration pursued the policy in the way that you suggest, that would have guaranteed to have, there's no way that the GOP would have supported that. I mean, that goes back, for decades in terms of sort of stalemate on trade policy in terms of the Republican opposition of putting labor and the environment on the table there. So I don't think, I think that would have dashed whatever hopes you would have had of this Congress supporting.
Wait, so you're telling me that because look, the administration was never, I'm not a fantasist. There was never going to be a trade agreement that wasn't acceptable to the Chamber of Commerce, right? Even if you had, some of the mainstream environmental groups and big labor more involved in the process. There was never going to be an agreement that wasn't acceptable to the Chamber. And you're telling me that an agreement acceptable to the Chamber, it's still going to face all the difficulties we talked about it facing, but there's just no reason that when the Chamber sits at the table, the environment and labor concerns aren't there as well. And
Heather, if this year has taught you anything, it should have taught you that the U.S. Chamber of Commerce does not necessarily dictate what the GOP is going to do in Congress.
Oh yeah, no, but that's hence my ultimate my pessimism about the trade deals, even the way they were negotiated.
Although that said, this is why the sort of debt ceiling shutdown in October might actually lead to this trade deal getting through, because this would be an example of an issue where sort of Main Street Republicans can say, see, we want to accomplish something, and these idiotic Tea Partiers, I don't know if they have a position on TPP, but it's a way in which they can demonstrate we're getting something done and it's something positive being accomplished, as opposed to just blocking, other sort of other sort of legislation.
Well, maybe a way of wrapping up is to say that 2013, it was also the year where U.S. domestic dysfunction really cost us very badly overseas. That if of all the dysfunction and administration miscues we've talked about, the cost imposed by the shutdown and debt ceiling debates, so much worse, and sequester. You don't agree? Ooh.
I'm going to disagree with you actually on this. I would say the following. I would say there's no doubt that, in terms of like a public relations sort of perspective, the debt ceiling was just that we looked horrible during that. And the budget sequester did not look good either. That said, I would make 2 points. The first is that if you take a look at things like, let's say, use of the dollar in the global economy, U.S. actually showed there was an increase in the use of the dollar over 2013. And there's been no evidence whatsoever that the debt ceiling has caused any sort of long-term blowback against U.S. economic power or economic influence. So as a result, I'm unconvinced that those sorts of dysfunctions has actually caused any kind of genuine rejection of the sort of U.S.-led international order. I would say by far much more important than the sort of debt ceiling shenanigans was Edward Snowden, the NSA business. That is far more, in terms of damage, the damage that has caused, both politically and I would argue economically, has been far more irreparable, because the political stuff we don't need to review, but the fact that U.S. tech companies now have to deal with a world that doesn't trust them because they think they're in bed with the NSA, the long-term implications of that are going to be really interesting.
Actually, that's the most important. I would argue the political implications of Snowden are significant, but not less irreparable, less fundamentally changing of how the U.S. works in the world than the economic implications that you pointed to. And I would also put the political implications of Snowden below the political implications of domestic dysfunction, which is different from the economic implications of domestic dysfunction. Which does raise the question of whether U.S. economic power in the world is now almost totally divorced from the economic policies of the U.S. government, which is kind of an odd place to be. But
well, in some ways, let me put it this way. So the good news is that despite everything that the United States did to shoot itself in the foot, you're actually looking at a U.S. economy that's actually kind of picking up steam rather nicely at this point.
Yeah.
And so the interesting, and furthermore, you actually saw, at least green shoots, I think was the phrase that you would use, of bipartisan cooperation, at least to prevent worst case scenarios. So the budget deal was a deal, and it actually means that we won't hopefully, have that kind of brinksmanship over the next couple of years. So, imagine if you could actually have cooperation on, let's say, trade and immigration. That might be foolhardy, but if you actually get that, I'm relatively confident that the sort of dysfunction of 2013 will be ephemeral rather than long-lasting in terms of its effect on U.S. image abroad.
From your lips to God's ear. The last thing I wanted to say is that 2013 was the year where national security coherence in our two political parties completely fell away. Yeah. And nobody knows what's coming in its place in 2014. And so that's going to be one of the really fascinating things to watch in the next year. Sort of how do new tendencies and schools of thinking about national security line up in the American political system? And hopefully you and I will be back here talking about that.
Oh, that'll be fun. I would even go further, which is the one thing I'm looking forward, as much as, I was stunned the extent to which, 2016 was entering our conversations this year about, who's stepping up to run for president and so on and so forth. The 2016 debate about foreign policy will be very interesting, because as you point out, it's going to be split down the middle, I think, both in the Democratic and the Republican parties. And so as a result, you might see a much more vigorous debate than you saw in 2012, and that'll be fascinating.
Yeah. Well, I will close with an advertisement that I have an article under review addressing this, which will be a lot of fun even when it comes out.
Excellent. Well, have a happy 2014. And of course, we have to, the other thing to point out is that 2013 really was the best year ever, from the perspective of Red Sox fans.
Red Sox fans. Yes.
And I don't know if you read Grantland, but, there was a great article, by Randy, and I'm going to mispronounce his name horribly, Janizirli, I think, about the fact that the New York Yankees are now destined for sort of moderate short-term decline, because their business model is failing so badly in terms of signing overpriced free agents. So I think in terms of baseball, the next couple of years it can only just get better.
Well, since my other team is the Nationals, I hope you're right about that, because I'm a little bit concerned that it can only go downhill.
Oh no, I think the Nationals had a good offseason. I think they're going to bounce back this year. I really do.
Right. Well, that's spoken truly like a Red Sox fan, that it can only go downhill from here.
So,
on that cheerful note, Dan, see you in 2014.
Likewise. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.